Hi, this is Professor Makimura. So here we go. This is the first of the lectures that will take us to the 1500s. And we're going to cover the Middle East first. Here we go. History of the Middle East until the early modern period, from the Sumerians to the Ottomans. Okay, the very first human civilization was the Sumerian civilization. Um, so here's what happened. Human beings, when they first emerged, as far as the DNA evidence and the science tells us, is that we were hunter-gatherers. And as hunter-gatherers, we roamed the earth. But we primarily roamed the earth near Africa. But then, human beings spread out from Africa and continued to live hunter-gathering lives until around 5,000 years ago. Sorry, 5,000 BC, until about 7,000 years ago. There are many hypotheses why human beings stopped being hunter-gatherers. One guess is that what happened is that the climate changed. You had the ice age, and then the earth warmed up, and then the earth got a little bit cold again. And when the earth got a little bit cold again, those people who couldn't hunt anymore basically tried to find a new way to survive, and they chose farming. So by choosing farming, they now basically are sedentary. They're now in one location. And because they are now in one location, they begin to gather in these fertile areas. And because there aren't that many fertile areas back then, well, I mean, there are, but there aren't that many suitable for, fertile areas for easy farming back then. They gather in a number of certain locations. One of these was what was called the Fertile Crescent. The eastern edge of which is modern day Iraq. So, in the southern part of modern day Iraq, uh, you had this civilization called the Sumerian civilization. It's called a civilization because they began to congregate in one location and form cities. So the word civilization comes from the word city in Latin, right? Civ, C-I-V, that's the base. Uh, Civis, right? It's the Latin word for city, but CIV is the basis for the word civilization. Um, and because the Sumerians created the first civilization, what the Sumerians had essentially becomes the template for what it means to be a civilization. And so, what does it mean to be a civilization? Well, what did the Sumerians have? The Sumerians had agriculture, they had cities, they also had writing. The Sumerians were one of the, not the one, the Sumerians were the first people to invent writing. The Sumerians had a form of government, the Sumerians had a form of religion, and the Sumerians had a form of technology. Their government was basically a government of city states where each city was its own country. And their religion was polytheistic. They had many, many gods. In fact, each city had its own patron god. Of these various Sumerian cities, one of the most influential and powerful city was the city of Uruk, Uruq, Uruk, and it is from the city name Uruk that you get the modern name of the country Iraq from. Uruk becomes Iraq, right? Um, and the civil technology that the Sumerian civilization had was Bronze Age technology. The civilizations that will follow will quickly develop into iron using technology. I think the Hittites were one of those people that adopted Iron Age technology first. So the government and their religion was fused, meaning that the leader of their city was also a high priest of their religion who, talked to the various gods and governed sort of through a theocratic form where government and religion was fused. Okay. The Sumerians were the first civilization, and as the first civilization, they pretty much were unparalleled by anybody else in terms of their power and ability to, uh, you know, control the neighboring areas. But quite quickly, other hunter-gatherer societies catch on to this concept and begin to adopt city life themselves. So the first people to adopt city life are the Semitic peoples. Of these Semitic peoples, the Akkadians are of note. The Akkadians begin to build cities to the north of the Sumerians in what will be in uh, modern day near modern day Baghdad. And then further to the north of them would be uh, uh, the Indo-European speakers. Uh, I don't know if they're part of the Aryans, but they are the Indo-European speakers called the Hittites in modern day, in the southeastern part of modern day Turkey. So other peoples begin to adopt agriculture, and as they adopt agriculture, they begin to adopt city life as well, and they begin to rival the Sumerians. But the Sumerians basically are the dominant people for about 1,000 years, from 3000 BC to around 2000 BC, until the dominance shifts to the Akkadians. The Akkadians then lose their dominance to the Assyrians. The Assyrians and the Babylonians duke it out for supremacy for another 1,000 years between them. Um, in the end, the Hittites show up. Indo-European speakers, the Hittites show up. They throw a monkey wrench into the thing, but the Babylonians come back on top. Um, it is during the second Babylonian upswing from 700 BC to 539 BC, that they discover a people called the Jews, who supposedly worship only one God, and they capture many of their leaders and bring them back to Babylon. So at that point, right, the Sumerian civilization and their successors merge with the biblical story of how the Jewish people, who are also Asemitic people, were initially herders, so they were not urban dwellers, so they were not civilized yet. They didn't live in cities yet, but they were herders, and they were traveling from back and forth until finally they began to settle down in a place called Palestine. And then Palestine was conquered by the Neo-Babylonians. And then the Neo-Babylonians brought back those Jews to Babylon. And there you go. So their first writing. Their first writing is called cuneiform writing. It literally means wedge-shaped writing. And it's really hard to tell from this screen here. But it's like these wedge-shaped things. And we can actually decipher this. We have something akin to the Rosetta Stone for the cuneiform tablets, or cuneiform tablets. I prefer to call it cuneiform. Um, and these tablets basically tell us some interesting details about what life was like in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient uh, in ancient Iraq. One of the funniest one I've heard, it was done by a BBC curator, and she was talking about how there's a story of, I want to say Assyrian, but it could be Akkadian, but I don't know, whatever. But there's the story of these merchants traveling from back and forth. One of these tablets basically is being sent to his business partner. It's either his business partner or his son or some family member, I forget which. And it's basically saying, when you cross here, there is a toll where the government is collecting taxes. And because I don't want you to pay taxes, please hide the merchandise in the cargo. And so they're trying to find schemes to dodge taxes. And that just cracked me up, because that just means that human beings haven't changed at all. Because people still try to dodge taxes today. Anyway, we're getting back on track. All right. So why is the Sumerian story important? The Sumerian story is important for a number of reasons. One is that it's the first civilization, so it brings a template. But another reason why they're important is because the Sumerians basically told stories of various things. And one of the stories they told is the story of Gilgamesh. And the story of Gilgamesh goes something like this. Gilgamesh was a two-thirds god, one-thirds man hero. Now, when he first shows up in the Gilgamesh story, he's not a hero. He's a tyrant. He's a terrible king. Because he is part god, and he's immensely powerful, so he can do whatever he wants. He can beat people up if he doesn't like them. He could sleep with any of the women that are in the city. It's like he's a terrible, terrible king, right? And the people of Uruk, he's the king of Uruk, and the people of Uruk cry out for help to they cry out to the gods, do something, and the gods answer, and the gods bring forth Enkidu. a wild man, a super powerful wild man who lives in the woods. And so Gilgamesh, when he hears about Enkidu, goes out into the woods to challenge Enkidu, and there they wrestle 3 days and 3 nights. And when they can't see who can, and when Gilgamesh can't beat Enkidu, and when Enkidu can't beat Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh for the first time meets his equal. And with that, they become friends. And Gilgamesh brings Enkidu from the wilds to the city. And Enkidu in the process also transforms, right? He shaves, he wears clothes, he sleeps with a human girl. And by doing these things, Enkidu basically stops being a wild man who can talk to the animals and becomes human. And so he can no longer talk to animals. And when Enkidu tries to talk to the animals run away because they now realize that Enkidu is fully human as well. That's not the important part of the story. The important part of the story is that Gilgamesh and Enkidu become friends, best friends, and they go on these journeys together. Um, and in one of these journeys, I think they meet Inanna, who is the patron goddess of Uruk. Inanna, her other names are Ishtar. Ishtar's other name is Astarte. And her name, when she becomes Greek, when she goes to Greece, she becomes known as Aphrodite. And when she is brought to Italy, the Italians begin to call her, the Romans call her Venus. So many of you have heard these names, Venus or Aphrodite, that she is originally the patron goddess of Uruk. Again, that's not the important part of the story. The important part of the story is that Gilgamesh and Uruk become fast friends and they go on these various journeys. And not only do they meet the patron goddess, one of the things they do is they go out west in search of treasure. And there they battle the the agent of the gods or something like that. And Enkidu is killed. Right? They win, but Enkidu is mortally wounded and Enkidu dies. And when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is like, oh my God, my best friend, my equal has died. Wait, that means I too can die, right? So after mourning the death of Gilgamesh and being very sad, Gilgamesh realizes that he too can die. And when he realizes that he too can die, Gilgamesh then goes out on a search for eternal life. And he searches far and wide. And one of the places he finds out there's this guy who's been living since the days before the flood. And in the Gilgamesh myth, it is assumed that people know that there was this massive, massive flood before the days of Gilgamesh. And if Gilgamesh was real, he's a god that lived between 2800 BC and 2500 BC. Okay. And in this great flood that killed almost all human beings, there's this one dude called Utnapishtim who survived. So this is your Noah, right? And Gilgamesh goes to see Utnapishtim to ask him how he has survived. And Utnapishtim says, "Well, I was a man who believed in the gods, and so I was very pious, and therefore the gods saved me. So my immortality is a gift from the gods, and so that's why I don't die. So I can't, transfer this gift to you. But because I lived so long, I know that there is a way for you to live, maybe not forever, but for you to not die of old age. So you stop aging." And Gilgamesh said, "Okay, that's good enough." And after Gilgamesh hears how he does it, how to get that potion, he goes and collects everything. And one of the things is that it's like this seaweed that's in the bottom of the ocean floor. He gets it, but in the end, before Gilgamesh gets back home, a serpent comes and snatches away that gift. And so Gilgamesh returns home to his home city, Uruk, heartbroken that he will never be, you know, uh, he will never live forever. Now, but when he comes back, this great journey, of going on these adventures with Enkidu, uh, meeting with the gods, losing his best friend, search for immortality, all these things have transformed Gilgamesh so that by the time he returns to the city, he is now a good king. And he rules justly over the city of Uruk until he dies. Okay. There are multiple endings to this Gilgamesh story, it turns out. But one ending ends here. And when you just read this story basically says this: hey, eternal life isn't about living forever. Most people have never heard of Ur-Namishtim, but the name Gilgamesh has lived on. Why? Why do people know the name Gilgamesh? People know the name Gilgamesh because he has done great deeds. So true immortality isn't living forever physically. True immortality is doing great deeds so that other people talk about you, right? And even if you aren't talked about by everybody, if even your family members remember you, that's good enough for a lot of people, right? Uh, that is one way to read the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this focus on doing great deeds so that other people remember you is one of the reasons why the ancients lived. Right? When the ancients lived, they had, they had many life goals, but for a lot of them, a lot of the ambitious ones anyway, the thing that basically gets them is that they want to do amazing deeds so that people remember them by, and this kind of mindset basically is there, and is going to be transferred over to the Greeks as well. And when the Greeks get it, it's not just going to be the politicians and warriors and stuff, but even like pottery makers, uh, you know uh, uh, athletes, right, musicians, all these people want to be known, and they will be known. So in the ancient Greek world, for example, they have the Olympics. And one of the things they did is that they actually carved the name of the victors of the Olympics in the stone, so that if you go to ancient Greece, if you go to Greece today, you can actually see the names carved into stone of the winners of the first Olympiad. So those names have lived on forever, right? I mean, you might not know the name itself, but those names. The name Phidias. Phidias was the artist slash architect of important art and temples in ancient Greece, and some people like me remember that name because he recorded his name in these places, and other people have recorded that he is the guy who designed the Parthenon, right? Everybody knows the Parthenon, right? They may not know the architect Phidias, but if you start to learn anything about the Parthenon, very quickly you realize that the Parthenon was designed by Phidias, and that the statue of Pallas Athena, the statue of Athena, the patron goddess of Athens, was also, sculpted by Phidias. Or you know about the various Greek poets. You don't have to be a man; you can be a woman. There's a very famous Greek poet by the name of Sappho. Right? These people wrote their names down, and their great deeds have been passed down to posterity. Um, and potters, right? Ancient Greek potters actually also etched in their names inside the pottery, so we actually know who made the Attic pottery of ancient Greece. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is important because it shows you one reason why the ancients lived. The ancients lived to do great deeds so that other people will remember them by. Now, another alternate ending of Gilgamesh ends with Gilgamesh returning to the city, being a great king, and then it goes on for a bit longer about what life is like in the city of Uruk. And it basically says how this life will be repeated over and over and over again. And when the story ends that way, then the Epic of Gilgamesh takes a very different tone. You could read the Epic of Gilgamesh as, well, Gilgamesh the king went on this epic journey, but he came back and ultimately was all for naught. What was the point? Wouldn't it be better if you were just an ordinary person living in the city of Uruk who grows up with his family or her family, lives and dies happy, surrounded by family, surrounded by their grandkids? Isn't that life worth living? And that's another way to read the Epic of Gilgamesh. Um, so the Sumerians are important because they leave the Epic of Gilgamesh behind with multiple endings that basically give you hints on what the ancients lived their life for. Right? One is for doing great deeds. Another is living a fulfilling family life. That's what's most important. Take your pick. Modern day society is a capitalist society. We do not live this way. A capitalist society is a society in which society as a whole has more or less agreed that making money is the most important thing, because the word capital means money. So we like to call it capitalism because it's less crass, but really, if you really stop for a moment and think about it, it's moneyism. That's the society that we're living in right now. And most people know deep down that money alone isn't going to bring you happiness. Money is important, there's no question about it, but uh, it's it's not the only, it's not the most important thing. Although in a capitalist society, they try to make you think that way. Okay, so next to in the Fertile Crescent, on the other side of the Fertile Crescent is Egypt. So the crescent goes like this, right? So on the other side of the Fertile Crescent is ancient Egypt. Uh, well, the Fertile Crescent goes like this. It goes up to Syria, and then you can go down, and then you get to ancient Egypt. And ancient Egypt is also very, very old, but they show up slightly after the Sumerians. So there's still debate. Some people say that they've been influenced by the Sumerians to create a civilization in ancient Egypt, and others say, no, ancient Egypt's origin actually traces more from ancient Africa. We know that the Sahara Desert was a vast, green, lush land, 6,000 years ago, and then it slowly turned into a desert. And as it slowly turned into a desert, all these people escaped the Sahara Desert and came to the Nile River. And there, as they escaped the Sahara, as it became a desert, they began to practice agriculture along the Nile River. In which case, it would be a separate origin from the Sumerians. By the way, we have no idea where the Sumerians came from. The Sumerians probably were from the Middle East somewhere, and they set up shop in southern Iraq and started doing their thing to create the first civilization. Anyway, did the Egyptians get their ideas from the ancient Sumerians? Maybe, maybe not. No way to know. Uh, but well, one thing is for certain: they rival the Sumerians in terms of ancientness. They rival the Sumerians in terms of these grand architecture. The Sumerians built ziggurats. The Egyptians would build pyramids. The ziggurats are made out of mud bricks. The pyramids are made out of stone. So the pyramids withstood the test of time, much more so than the ziggurats did. And according to the Greeks claim that they get a lot of their civilization from the ancient Egyptians. Although I personally think that the Greeks get more out of the Mesopotamians, right, from the Sumerians and their descendants, successors, than the Egyptians. But well, yeah, doesn't matter. All right. So the difference between ancient Egypt and ancient Sumeria is this: ancient Egypt very quickly became unified, so they lived under one king. After Egypt was unified, this king became the pharaoh. The pharaoh is both a god and a king. So, like the Sumerians, they are also a theocracy where religion and government is fused. Like the Sumerians, the ancient Egyptians also invented writing. The Egyptian writing system is famously the hieroglyphics. Why do I have this thing popping up over here? Don't need that. The hieroglyphics is literally the sacred writing used by the priests of ancient Egypt. And so when the ancient Egyptian religion died out, the priests went with it, and people could no longer read the hieroglyphics for a long, long time until the Rosetta Stone was discovered. The Rosetta Stone was discovered by Napoleon when Napoleon and the French army were in Egypt, and it basically is a stone that replicates, not replicates, that talks about Queen Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt. But Cleopatra was Greek. Her family was Greek. So interestingly, what you get is in one stone you have hieroglyphics, you have Egyptian demotic. Demotic is the script that the Egyptians were using to write their daily stuff. That's not used by the priests, but demotic was derived from hieroglyphics, and you also had ancient Greek. And we could read ancient Greek and we could read Demotic. We had scholars who could read it back then. And when they found out, what they found out was that the stuff written in Demotic and the stuff written in Greek are exactly the same, which means the stuff written in hieroglyphics is probably the same. And with that assumption, they began to decipher the hieroglyphics, and it turns out that guess was correct. And now we can read the hieroglyphics. So There you go. Now, here's what's very interesting. The hieroglyphics become Egyptian demotic. Uh, Once it becomes Egyptian demotic, the Phoenicians, a seafaring people living on the Levant, modern day Lebanon, basically pick this up and goes, wow, this is a very useful way to write things down and record things. And they begin to write things down in Phoenician. And then when the Phoenicians, in their own language, Phoenician, and when the Phoenicians go out into the Mediterranean Ocean, they encounter the Greeks. And when the Greeks encounter the Phoenicians, they go, oh, what is this? Oh, we call this writing. And the Greeks say, oh, well, then we want this too. And the Greeks then began to take the Egyptian hieroglyphics, which became Demotic, which became Phoenician, into Greek alphabets. Alpha and beta are the first two letters in the Greek system, and so we call it the alphabet. And from the Greeks, that goes to Italy, and then the Italians, specifically the Romans, pick it up, or the Latins pick it up, and it becomes the basis of the Latin alphabet. And then from the Latin alphabet, it spreads to the rest of Western Europe, and English today uses the Latin alphabet. Now, from Greece, that Greek alphabet goes to the north, and eventually it becomes the Cyrillic alphabet for people who speak Slavic languages. And so the people who speak a Slavic language are, of course, the Russians. And so the Russians write things in the Cyrillic alphabet, which is ultimately derived from the Greek alphabet. So far, all the Western style alphabet come out of the Phoenicians, who come out of hieroglyphics, right? Now, there's very good evidence to suggest that this happened in the East as well. So this demotic got transferred over to the Middle East. Well, I mean, they're in the Middle East. They got transferred over to Mesopotamia, to modern day Iraq, where the Sumerians were. And compared to the compared to the cuneiform, which they were using back then, the demotic was a lot better, a lot easier. And so eventually the demotic was demotic pushed out the use of cuneiform, and the Demotic slash Phoenician alphabet became the Aramaic alphabet, and then it's from that Aramaic alphabet that you get modern day Hebrew and Arabic, right? And then there's good evidence to suggest that these people had contact with the Indians, and because they brought their writing to all the way to India through trade, the Indians then picked up that Aramaic alphabet and used it as a basis for the Sanskrit alphabet. Once you get to Sanskrit, this part is no longer, this part is proven. Sanskrit then goes over the Himalayan mountains to become Tibetan. The Tibetans, basically, a Tibetan monk then brings that writing to the Mongolians, and the Mongolians then begin to write in a old Mongolian script called the Fagspa script. And then the Korean king, Sejong, I think, is the guy who basically says, oh, that's actually a pretty good idea, and uses the Foxpa script as the inspiration to create Korean Hangul. And so every single alphabet that you have in this world today ultimately can trace its origin to Egyptian hieroglyphics, which is pretty cool, right? One of the points of this course is to try to show you how human beings are all connected, that none of us are an island. And the story of the alphabet is one of those stories that show you how human beings are all connected. Now, if you're using the Mayan-based script, obviously you're not part of this. But the Mayan-based script is a syllabary; it's not an alphabet. If you're using a Chinese-based script, that's actually ideographic, so it's closer to the Egyptian hieroglyphics. So that's actually also not an alphabet. And if you're using a Japanese script, hiragana and katakana, those are also like the Mayan script syllabaries, so they're also not an alphabet as well. So again, if you're using an alphabetical system, then an alphabetical system ultimately can trace its origin all the way back over to ancient Egypt, which is pretty cool. All right. So you get these two very different civilizations, the Sumerian civilization and the Egyptian civilization, but it is with the Persians that they get united. So the Persians emerged from around here. They have their cousins called the Medes who live over here. And the Medes initially were ruling over the Persians, but the Persians conquer the Medes, and together they conquer Mesopotamia, which is here. So this is where Babylon was. You see Babylon here. This is where Babylon was. Down here is where Sumeria was. Up here is where the Hittites were. Over here is Egypt. And the Persians conquer here. Then they conquer Lydia, they conquer Egypt, and they also conquer the western half of the Indus Valley region, and they conquer parts of Central Asia. And the Persians become the first world empire, right? So this first world empire is the Achaemenid Empire, Achaemenid Empire, sorry. That lasts from 550 BC to 330 BC. And they, like the Sumerians, formed a template for what it means to be a world empire. So what does it mean to be a world empire? Well, basically what you have to do is you have to build a highway system to connect all parts of the empire. The Persians had the royal road, but they also had other roads to connect the empire together. They had unified the currencies, they unified weights and measures. As empires emerge, the similar thing will happen. Uh, the Chinese will do the same. They will unify currency, they'll unify writing, they'll unify all these things. The interesting thing about the Persians, though, is that they didn't unify religion. They left the religion alone. They basically said, "You believe in whatever religion you want. We believe in ours." And the Persian religion was Zoroastrianism. So, what is Zoroastrianism? Zoroastrianism is basically the idea that there are two main gods in this world. One is the god of light, Ahura Mazda, and the other is the god of darkness, Angra Mainyu, otherwise known as Ahriman. So it is this world is a constant battle between the god of light and the god of darkness. And it is duty, it is our duty as human beings to side with the god of light to make sure that that side wins. Yeah. So there you go. This neatly explains the reason why there's bad things in the world, right? Now, the Jews who the Bible story basically says that, the Jews were trapped in Egypt and they left Egypt because Moses led them out of Egypt. And then eventually they went to the land of milk and honey, which is Palestine. Um, this part is maybe true, maybe not. I mean, there's just too many God things in there. So if you really believe in the Bible story, it's possible. Another reason why this story is possible, where the Jews left Egypt, is because you have the story of the Egyptian kings who tried to establish monotheism in ancient Egypt. But that monotheism failed, and ancient Egypt returned to a polytheistic religion. So there is a possibility that the Jews who left Egypt were a group of Egyptians who wanted to believe in one God instead of many gods, and so they left Egypt. I mean, it's possible, but there's no way to know, right? But here's what we do know. When the uh, Persian Empire emerges, you have a king. The king is called Cyrus. Well, emperor, really, because he's the king of kings. The king of kings, Cyrus, otherwise known as the great father in the Bible. He shows up in the Bible, and by this point in time, the Bible is very historical. And Cyrus meets the ancient Jews and asks, "Why are you guys here?" And the Jews basically say, "We are here because we're supposed to be monotheistic and believe in one God, but we didn't. We believed in many gods. So, as punishment, we were defeated by the Babylonians and we were captured by them. We were brought over to Babylon as captives." And Cyrus hears that and goes, "Oh, well, we too believe in the one true God, the God of light. So, you guys are now free to go. And here's some extra money for you to go back to Palestine or to Israel and rebuild the temple to God." And the Jews are ecstatic about this, which is why in the Bible, the Persians are seen as the good guys. They are the liberators. Okay. But the point here that I wanted to get across is two. One is that the Persians, although they unified many things, they left culture alone. They left people's religion alone. They said, "You can believe in whatever religion you want." That's one thing they did. The other thing is that the Jews probably fully became monotheistic after the Babylonian captivity and after the release by Cyrus. Um, And in the release from Cyrus and in the contact with the Persians, they probably also came into contact with the idea uh, of the evil god. And so I think in the Jewish religion, you start to get the emergence of something called Satan, right? And in the Christian religion, Satan takes not a central role, but Satan takes a major role because he's there to, challenge God. So there you go, right? The point here is that the Bible is not something that just pops out of nowhere. It also comes out of this Middle Eastern brew of all these different religious ideas, and it comes out, and ultimately the Jewish religion and then the Christian religion will emerge out of that. All right. The Islamic religion, Islam will also emerge out of this, this hodgepodge of religions that exists in the Middle East. Okay. So the Persians. So the Persians are perceived as the good guys in the Bible, but the Greeks perceive the Persians as the bad guys. And the reason why the Greeks perceive the Persians as the bad guys is because under Darius and then under Xerxes, the Persians tried to conquer the Greeks twice. Now they will both fail. Now when they fail, a little bit about like 100 years and after or so, Alexander, whose father had finally unified the quarreling Greeks, will basically use that as a pretext to then go out and conquer the Persians. So Alexander's empire will then take the Greeks and then impose the Greeks on top of what already existed, the Persian Empire. And you get the creation of what is called Hellenistic culture, which blends these Middle Eastern cultures with Greek culture. Um, and this Hellenistic culture is very influential. It spreads all over the world. Uh, I mean, literally all over the world. It spreads all the way to India, and then eventually its, ideas, or not ideas, but its elements spreads to China and to some extent to Japan. And this Hellenistic influence also will flow westwards as well, and the Romans will come into contact with this Hellenized Greeks. Uh, Hellenized Greek sounds weird with these Greeks because the Greeks are the Hellenes. The Romans will come into contact with these Greeks, and eventually, what's going to happen is this: Alexander is going to die young, and when he dies young, he's not going to leave an adult heir, and because of that, his generals divide up Alexander's empire, and Alexander's generals and the descendants of Alexander's generals are going to fight each other, and the Eastern Mediterranean is going to be a giant mess. Meanwhile, the Western Mediterranean is going to have a climactic war between the Romans and the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians are descendants of these Phoenician settlers. So the Romans call these Phoenicians, Phoenician Punics, right? Phoenicians, aka Punics. And so after the Romans win against the Phoenicians, the Punic Wars, the Carthaginians, after the Romans win against these guys, the Romans will unify the Western Mediterranean. And so it's going to be a battle between a unified Western Mediterranean and a divided Eastern Mediterranean. And surprise, surprise, the unified Western Mediterranean under the Romans are going to win against the divided Eastern Mediterraneans, the divided Greeks. And the Romans will create the Roman Empire. So this is the extent of Alexander's empire. The eastern half is going to be lost. And the western part of Alexander's empire, this bit here, is going to be incorporated as part of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And the western half is this part over here. So these are the world empires. What happened to the part where Alexander's empire was lost? Well, the local Persians eventually will rise up and take over and rule over that area as their own empire. It is the Parthian Empire. Later, the Parthian Empire will be replaced by the Sassanid Empire. But the Parthian Empire, Sassanid Empire, these are all descendants of or successors to the original Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire of 550 BC to 330 BC. So that takes us, the Sassanids will take us all the way to 651 AD, and that takes us like 1,000 years. But for like 1,000 years during this period, right, Middle East is divided. The Western part is incorporated as part of the Western world, as part of the Roman world, as part of the Greek world. and the eastern part basically is part of the Asian world. One thing I want people to notice here is that although we tend to think of these regions as sort of like, like kind of obvious, they only seem obvious to us in hindsight, or they only seem obvious to us because we're used to it. These regions are ultimately, uh, you know, our way to conveniently divide the world. And usually we're using, not only just geographical elements, but also cultural elements to define these, borders. These borders are not like, closed off borders, but these borders are much more porous and they have all these connections between them. Again, it's the whole idea of human connections across the world is one of these things that I want to talk about. And the Persians and these world empires, whether it's the Greeks or the Romans, are a great example because they show you how they're all connected to each other. The Romans were one of the more open empires as well. Right? As long as you accepted certain rules within the Roman Empire, anybody could become a Roman citizen. And that's what led to its stability. Uh, Anyway, I don't want to just get dragged on this because we're running out of time. Well, not running out of time, but time is ticking. Uh, so this is the Parthian Empire, and this is the Sassanid Empire. The Sassanid Empire, temporarily holds on to this, but it's primarily over on this side here. This western part is ruled by the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, by this point in time. The Roman Empire itself will break up into two halves between the eastern half and the western half. Um, and the western half will collapse in 476 AD, but the eastern half will survive all the way until 1453. Now, although the eastern half will survive all the way until 1453, a significant portion of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, will be lost to the Muslims. So I think we'll talk about Islam, and that will probably be all we need to get to. Well, no, yeah, but that would be the last bit, that's big section we need to talk about for the Middle East. So Islam is a new religion that emerges around this point in time. Now, the interesting thing about Islam, or the reason why you needed Islam, probably is because these empires that emerges take on that Persian mindset of not interfering in the local cultures, in particular the religions. And that in itself is a very noble thing to do, but a major problem that comes out of that is that these local religions don't necessarily all get along. That's one, and two, a lot of these religions basically have a dependency on the role of the priests. The role of the priests is pretty big. The Jewish religion, after the destruction of the Temple of Solomon by the Romans, less so, but the other religions, the priests play a central role in their societies, and if you if you can't get along with that priest, then you're kind of like cut out from that community. That ain't good. So, because if you don't have a community, then you have no support network back then. So then you have to join a different religion. Uh, so the support networks were tied to the religions, and the religions were dominated by the priests. And what Christianity and what Islam tried to do, one of the things that they tried to do was try to break the power of these priests. But then, in Christianity, the power of the priests come back. But in Islam, they tried to break the power in the early Christianity and in Islam, they tried to break the power of the priests, and they tried to talk about a direct connection between human beings and God. Right. So Muhammad is the prophet of Islam. He's born around 570 AD and dies in 632 AD. He has his first revelation in 610 AD. And he begins to proselytize to his family and to his friends, and it quickly spreads. By 622, he has enough converts so that they leave Mecca and they go to Medina. And then after they go to Medina, they gather even more converts, and then ultimately they come back to Mecca and defeat the Arab leaders to then lead a conquest to unify the Arabian Peninsula under the banner of Islam. And from that moment onwards, Mecca basically becomes converted to the holy place of Islam. It was already a holy place to polytheistic Arabs, but the polytheistic idols are all destroyed, and the Kaaba, the dome is the, that thing that sits in the middle of Mecca is placed, and it becomes the focal point of their religion. And again, one of the points of Islam is that you're trying to break the power of the priest. So, among the five tenets of Islam, the first one is prayer. You don't have to rely on the priest for prayer. You yourself do the prayer 5 times a day. All right. And then there are four other main tenets, four pillars of Islam. There are what? Almsgiving, prayer, almsgiving, Ramadan, the Hajj. I'm missing one. Oh, the very first one. The very first one is the acceptance that there's only one God and that Muhammad is his last and greatest of all prophets. That's all. Right? So, according to Islam, because they believe in the one God, they accept that Judaism and Christianity are also full-fledged religions, that because they all believe in the same God. But the key difference is that in Islam, they say that Moses and the other Jewish leaders are just regular prophets, and that Jesus is also a holy man, but he's just a prophet. He's not the Son of God. And it is Muhammad, the last, and who is the last prophet that is the greatest of all prophets. So there you go. Oh yeah, right here. I wrote it now. Faith, prayers, almsgiving, Ramadan, pillars. Why did I try to remember? I wrote it. So after Muhammad dies, you have a series of caliphs called the four rightful caliphs. Right? Caliphs means deputy. Four rightful deputies who rule on behalf of Muhammad, and these guys also continue the conquest. So the conquest of the Middle East is to conquer Levant, Egypt, and then Persia. Persia will finally fall, and the Persian Empire will be brought into the fold. Once the Persian Empire is brought into the fold, all the know-how, technical know-how of how to run a vast empire is brought in, and with that, they will further the conquest and maintain a vast empire that stretches all the way from modern day Pakistan to Portugal. Right? This vast empire that goes across. Okay. Now here we go. Um, the last of these four rightful caliphs was Ali, but Ali was killed, and when Ali is killed, a member of the Umayyad family takes over, and his child then becomes the next caliph. And so this caliphate, although they're called caliphs, are not really caliphs anymore, but they're more kings, right? Because they're dynastic. They're children's children, right? So if you're the caliph, then your child becomes the next caliph. Right? So if you're the king, your child is a prince, and when he grows up, he becomes the next king. Or when the previous king dies, he becomes the next king. Monarchy. All right. Now, in Islam, a lot of people were unhappy with this. They basically thought that, why is power being concentrated in the hands of one family? This is wrong. And so one movement began to emerge, which basically was the party of Ali. And Ali was killed as the fourth and last of the four rightful killers. But Ali was also an important figure because he was the nephew of Muhammad and he married Muhammad's daughter. So by blood, he was the closest to Muhammad. And so people began to complain and say that, you know what, the leaders of the Islamic world ought to be descendants of Muhammad, because Muhammad was the last and was the last prophet. So his bloodline is important. So it should be his offspring that should be the leaders of the Islamic world. And the Abbasids, who came from a family that was related to Muhammad, said, yeah, no, we agree. And they led a rebellion to topple the Umayyads. And once the Umayyads were toppled, the Abbasids then suddenly turned around and betrayed Ali's descendants and said, no, you know what? That's wrong. There's nothing in Islam that says only the descendants of Muhammad should be the leaders of Islam. Look at the other three prophets. Whoever is the most virtuous should be the leader of the Islamic world. And so the Abbasids then installed themselves as the new caliph, saying that it ought to be the the most virtuous that ought to be the next leader of Islam. And it just so happens that the Abbasid's son is the next most virtuous person. So when I die, my son will take over. And so a dynastic principle is reinstalled, but this time around with a new idea. So with this, when the transition from the Umayyads to the Abbasids, you get the Sunni Shia divide in Islam. The Shia believe that the descendants of Muhammad ought to be the leaders of Islam. The Sunni believe that the most virtuous ought to be the leaders of Islam. Uh, I said he was a cousin, but I think he's nephew, so I'm going to change nephew. You know what? I'm going to look this up. It says cousin. Who knew? All right, maybe I'll change it back to cousin. Yeah. So, when you go back and look back at this past history, they go, all right. So after Ali, then are the Umayyads, legitimate or not? And the Sunnis will then retroactively say, yeah, the Umayyads are legitimate because only those by taking over, they proved that they were the most virtuous, and the Abbasids are also okay. They are the majority of the Muslims today. The Sunnis are like 80% of the Islamic world. Only about 20% of the Muslims today are Shias, but they're all pretty much concentrated among the Persians. The Persians today, well, modern day Iran, they are mostly all Shias, people who believe that Muhammad's descendants should govern. So that's the rise of Islam. Now, one of the ways that the Muslims allowed the Christians and the Jews to do their own thing was to basically say, well, you guys we all believe in the same God, so we're not going to really persecute you, but you do have to pay an extra tax, and you do have to accept your status as second class citizens. We Muslims are on top. So that was the Islamic tolerance that would exist all the way until the 19th century, where Christians and Jews would be tolerated by Muslim rulers as long as they paid an extra tax. Zoroastrians were also initially tolerated, as far as I remember. I could be wrong about this, but I think the Zoroastrians were also tolerated because they also said that they believe in the one true God, and all they had to do was pay an extra tax. So initially, the Arab Empire had no real desire to convert people because as long as they didn't convert, then they had to pay an extra tax, right? But as time goes on, people realize, well, if we're believing in the same God, why am I paying this stupid extra tax? And people begin to drop their religion. And so, although Egypt was conquered in like 642 AD, by 1000 AD, the population is like 50% Muslim and 50% Christian. And by the time you get to 1980, 900 years after that, the population is something like 25% Christian and 75% Muslim. And by the time you get to 2000 AD, that population ratio has dropped to under 10%. Today, under 10% of the population in Egypt is Christian, over 90% are Muslims. So there was a slow Islamicization of the Middle East. And because of the Islamicization, today, we, without thinking about it, consider the Middle East to be its own region that includes places like Egypt, because they are primarily Muslims today. All right. So how did the Christians feel about this? Well, the Christians emerged, around 180 with the birth of Jesus Christ and his message. And it becomes its own religion by around 50 AD. And then it becomes the state religion of the Roman Empire in the 300s AD, 380 AD. And becomes widely entrenched until the rise of Islam. And the Muslims then come and take over Egypt, the Levant, including Palestine and Jerusalem and the Holy Land and all that. And the Eastern Roman Empire in particular are taking a huge beating because they've lost Egypt, they lost Syria, they lost Lebanon, they lost all of this, and now they're getting hurt by the rise of Muslim armies marching into Turkey towards Constantinople, which is here, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire. So what do? Around, well, actually, not around. In 1095 AD, the Eastern Roman Emperor writes a letter to the Pope asking for help, and the Pope acknowledges it. It's like, sure, we will help you. And excuse me, sorry about the yawn there. And the Pope calls on Western Christian knights to go and reconquer the Holy Land for Christianity, for God. And to show you that by the time you get to this period in history, the people are not driven primarily by doing great deeds, but people are now primarily driven by religion. Namely, people are driven by going to heaven. The Pope specifically says that if you go on these crusades to fight against the infidels, against the enemies, against the enemy, and you're not really looking for land or anything like that, then you're guaranteed to go to heaven. And the Crusades become this major movement where it's not just the knights, but even ordinary people want to go to fight on behalf of their religion. So there's a transition from the fall of the Roman Empire to the Middle Ages. There's a slow transition in society where people are no longer caring so much about doing great deeds, and people are now caring more about going to heaven. And that's the medieval mindset, and that's what the Crusades show. Now, when the Christian knights show up, they are a huge surprise to the Muslims, and so the Muslims lose badly. But the Muslims don't just give up, the Muslims fight back, and the leader that leads the Muslims is Saladin, a Kurd. So he's a Sunni. Who believes that the leader of the Islamic society ought to be the most virtuous man. But he's not a Persian. He's not an Arab. He's actually a Kurd. And eventually, Saladin, after defeating the Western Crusading Knights, becomes the Sultan of Egypt and reconquers Jerusalem and Levant. Right now, when the Christians and the Muslims are fighting like this, from the east, the Mongols come, and the capital of the Abbasid Empire, Baghdad, falls to the Mongols. And the Mongols were terrible. One of the stories, they didn't care about any of the cultural or literary uh, achievements of the classical world, and they just dumped all the libraries all the books in the library that the city of Baghdad had, and the ink melted, and the rivers turned black with ink from all the spilled and destroyed books. Uh, the Islamic world saw themselves as the heir to the Persians and to the Greeks and to the Romans, not surprisingly, because they control this area. And as such, they left records. They not left records. They translated a lot of the stuff that was written in ancient Greek, ancient Latin, ancient Persian, all into Arabic. And it is from that Arabic that a lot of it was retranslated back into European languages so that the Renaissance could happen. And the heart of that knowledge was destroyed by the Mongols. It's pretty bearable. The Mongols, after sacking Baghdad, would continue to run their rampage, and they will conquer all this to create the Ilkhanate. Meanwhile, the Muslims and the Christians are still fighting against each other over here. And the Christians, while the Mongols are conquering all this territory, have conquered this tiny bit over here and here. These are the Christian kingdoms that were created out of the conquests of the Middle East. So there you go. Now, why did this happen? There are many causes. One is that the Mongols are just really, really good warriors. So we can talk about the Mongols more later. I will probably talk more about the Mongols when we get to China. But another reason is that the Arab side, the Muslim side, were not exactly ready for this for sure. One is that the Muslim side was divided. Instead of saying Arabs, I'll say Muslims. Saladin had become the new leader of Egypt and then of the Levant, but the Abbasid Caliphate continued to, exercise authority near Baghdad. Now, what happened? Well, actually, let me pull this back. So, what happened was the Abbasid Caliphate, after conquering all this grand territory, right? Like they lost Spain, but after the Abbasid Caliphate had all this territory, they couldn't obviously hold on to it all together under one person. And so they began to devolve power, and eventually you got these things called sultans. Sultans are kings, essentially, kings who rule on behalf of the caliph, right, the deputy to the religious leader, Muhammad. Oh. Now that I think about it, in a sense, the Arab system is also a kind of a theocracy as well. Anyway, um, the the Muslim side were divided, so they couldn't show a united front against the Christians and to the Muslims, and they were fighting a war against the Christians, and so that certainly doesn't help. Um, then another thing that happens is that, as you can see by the fact that one of the leaders is Saladin, the Arab warriors basically have gradually over time lost their warrior spirit. So by the time the Mongols show up in like 1200s, it's like what 500 years after the Arab conquest of the 600s and 700s. And so, 500 years is a long time to remain ornery. And the Arabs are no longer really that ornery. They don't really like war that much. And so they begin to hire mercenaries. They begin to hire mercenaries to fight on their behalf. And the mercenaries that they hire on their behalf are the Turks. The Turks are good warriors, but they realize something very quickly. Hey, wait a second. Right now, we're hired by the Arabs, or we're the slaves of the Arabs because we were captured as children and were turned into slaves. But the Arabs don't have an army. We are the army. Why the hell we listen to their orders? And the Turks eventually revolt and established their own kingdoms inside what was formerly the Abbasid Empire, Abbasid Caliphate. So Egypt, which is probably the richest province, falls to a Kurdish leader. The Turks, who were hired to defend the Islamic world, basically realized that they can be on their own, and they established their own independent kingdoms. And the Mongols smash into this disarray and then just beat them one by one. Um, the Mongols actually send an army into Egypt, but the Egyptians defeat the Mongols, and the Mongols basically say, "All right, we've had enough. So we have enough territory. There's simply not enough Mongols anyway. So no point going any further." And they pull back, and that's it. So there you go. All right. So down here, I have the rise of Turks, and I'll talk about that, and then I think that leads us pretty much to the end. So who are the Turks? The Turks were originally a nomadic people that lived in Central Asia. And they were hired as mercenaries, or they were captured and sold into slavery to be slave warriors for Arab Muslims. But very quickly they realized that they are the military. And once that happens, the Turks establish power inside their own domains. The caliphate that Saladin establishes eventually turns into a slave state, in the sense that it turns into the Mamluk state, in the sense that Mamluk meaning slave, in the sense that the Turks, who are hired as warriors, overthrow their rulers and install themselves as the new leaders of Egypt. And it's these Turkish-led Egyptians that are able to defeat the Mongols when the Mongols try to invade into Egypt. Okay. Because Saladin is a guy who's running around in 1193. The Mongols are the people who are coming in 1250s. So, there's like a 50-year time lag after the death of Saladin. All right. So these Turks, when they realize that they can establish their own kingdoms, or that there's this fertile land down here, a lot of other Turks then realize, hey, well then why are we in this cold Central Asia? Why don't we go to the warmer part that's easier, that's got easier pickings? And many Turks begin to migrate from Central Asia into the Middle East. And one of these groups is the Ottoman Turks. Right. Well, initially one of these groups is the Seljuk Turks, but after the Seljuk Turks come the Ottoman Turks. And it is these Ottoman Turks that are ultimately responsible for the for the destruction of Constantinople or the conquest of Constantinople. And they turn Constantinople into Istanbul, their capital city. And that's in 1453. Now, before you get there, you get another part Turk, part Mongol leader by the name of Tamerlane. Tamerlane's not that important, but I'll just talk about him briefly. Tamerlane was an ambitious Turco-Mongol general, and his goal was to recreate the Mongol Empire. And in his own one generation, he's essentially able to recreate the western part of the Mongol Empire. So it's not a bad feat. It doesn't compare to the Mongols themselves who conquered all of everything. But Tamerlane conquers this, which is like a third. How do I fix this? There you go. Which is like a third of the former Mongol Empire. Did I fix it right? There we go. Now I fixed it right. Which is like a third of the former Mongol Empire. And save it. When he dies, his empire falls apart. And after his empire falls apart, the Ottoman Turks pick up where they were. The Ottoman Turks actually challenged Tamerlane once, and then the Ottoman Turks are smashed by Tamerlane. But after Tamerlane dies, the Turks come back. So that by the time we get to 1500s, you're going to get three major powers. One is two major powers. One is the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. Another is the Persians in the Middle East. And by 1700, they will truly dominate this region. Now, over here is India. India is going to be ruled by the Mughal Empire, and the Mughals are also a Muslim group. So you got these three Muslim empires that rule from southwestern all the way to South Asia, plus southeastern Europe and the northern coast of Africa, plus Egypt. So this is the three empires that will eventually become dominant. How should we think about this period that went on for so long? Well, in Western European history or Western civilization history, we usually do it in a three-part divide. The Old World, the ancient period, or the middle period, or the medieval period, and the new period, or the modern period. So ancient, medieval, modern is basically old, middle, new. That's what it is, right? And that actually kind of makes sense. The ancient period basically lasts from roughly 500 BC, when the Greeks come out of the Greek Dark Ages, till the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which is around 476 AD, so that's about 1,000 years. And then from the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the beginning of the early modern period, 1500 or 1492, that's another 1,000 years. So you get 1,000 years, 1,000 years, last 500 years, old, middle, new. Logical sense. If you try to do this for the Middle East, it goes really weird because the Middle Eastern history is really, really long. So you go from the ancient Middle East all the way from the Sumerians all the way to middle. And if you want to go all the way to the middle, then what? We're looking at the rise of Muhammad, maybe? So that's like 3000 BC to 650 AD. That's the 3,600 years, right? I mean, it's just ridiculously long. And then, 1,000 years or 900 years from 651 to 1453. Actually, 800 years from 651 to 1453. And then modern period from 1453 to the present. Or 1500 to the present. But still, it's like what? You get 500, 1,000, and 3,500. That's insane, right? And so I've tried to say, well, maybe for the Middle East, a better way to divide this is to divide not into three, but into four periods. So you get the ancient Middle East from the Sumerians to the Persians before this Middle East is united. And then the classical period where the Middle East is united, but before you get a monotheistic religion, Islam. So from the Persians to the Sassanids, right? 550 BC to 651 AD, which is 1,000 years. And then the Islamic Middle East from Muhammad to Tamerlane, which is 900 years, and then the modern period, where you get the Ottomans and the Safavids. Now, this is just a proposal. I mean, if you think this is wrong, let me know in class. I'm perfectly okay with that. And that ends this lecture, which went on long enough. I'll see you guys in the next one. Take it easy.